Hello, I'm Victoria from Biblio Lifestyle, and you're listening to the Reader's Couch podcast, the show that will help you bridge the gap between living a full and busy life to one where you're reading, learning new things, and having fun. In today's episode, I'm so excited to chat with author Katherine Faulkner to talk about her book, The Other Mothers. In The Other Mothers, we meet freelance journalist and stay-at-home mom Tash Carpenter. Tash is approached by Jane Blake, who believes her daughter Sophie, who is a local nanny, was murdered despite her being told it was an accident. Tash is reluctant at first, but when her son starts attending a playgroup, Tash finds herself with more free time to investigate the mysterious death of Sophie. And as she digs deeper into the case and befriends the other mothers from her son's playgroup, she starts to receive anonymous threats, which leads her to question who she can really trust. So in this episode, Katherine and I talk about The Other Mothers, her previous book, Greenwich Park, and Katherine shares lots of book recommendations and tips for readers interested in starting a reading habit and how to come out of a reading slump. Readers, I really enjoyed The Other Mothers. It was also one of the books selected for the 2024 Winter Reading Guide, so I was absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to chat with Katherine. But before we get into the episode, pretty please leave the podcast a 5-star rating, write me a review if you love the show, and share this episode or any of your favorite episodes with your bookish friends. Drop a link in the group chat, send them a text, send them an email, send them a DM on social media. Let them know about the Reader's Couch because it really helps the show. It doesn't cost you a penny and it helps to keep me and the show going. So thanks in advance. And now onto the episode with author Katherine Faulkner. Hi readers, welcome again to the Reader's Couch. I'm your host, Victoria Wood, and here on the couch with me to talk about her new book, The Other Mothers, is author Katherine Faulkner. Hi Katherine, welcome to the Reader's Couch.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yay! I'm so thrilled to have you here. Your new book, The Other Mothers, is available. I always want to know, how are authors feeling? So how are you feeling that book 2 is now available and readers can get their hands on a copy?
Oh, I'm so pleased. It always feels like such a long time coming. The process is such a long one between finishing the book and it really, getting into the hands of readers. And it's always super exciting when you start getting people who are really just reading it and saying, I can't put it down. I've been up all night with it. That's my favorite part of being published, getting messages like that from all over the world when the books actually hit the shelves. So yeah, it's my favorite part. I love it.
Oh, sounds amazing for sure. But before we get into things, I want listeners to hear it straight from you. Tell us about your new book, The Other Mothers. What's your elevator pitch and what can readers expect when they pick up a copy?
So The Other Mothers tells the story of Tash, who is a new mother and journalist, and she's trying to relaunch her journalistic career as a freelancer after the birth of her son. And so she's kind of looking for her next big scoop to relaunch her career with. But she's also looking for friendship. She's feeling quite lonely and lost in motherhood, and she's looking for friends to help her navigate that. And at her son's playgroup in a very bougie area of London, she sees these other mothers who seem to have the perfect life that she wishes she had, the kind of houses she looks at on Rightmove and wonders how anyone can ever afford them. And these other mothers are very seductive, and they end up inviting Tash into their exclusive little circle. But when Tash starts investigating the death of a young nanny, hoping this is the scoop that she has been waiting for, she realizes that the more she looks into it, the closer she's getting to the lives of these other mothers, and that they are entangled in this case somehow. And then she starts to wonder whether there's another reason she's been invited into their clique.
Yes, absolutely. And I want us to dive into Tash a bit. But before we do that, let's talk about the nanny. Tell us about Sophie and Sophie's mom, Jane, who is the person who kind of got in touch with Tash. So tell us about Jane and her daughter, Sophie.
So Sophie is a young nanny. She is working initially as a worker in a playgroup, and then she kind of gets poached by one of the mothers to go and work in their household and as a private live-in nanny. And what Sophie's storyline, we see it unfold through, in her words, as Tash kind of investigates it. So you've got a dual timeline going on. So you're hearing Tash uncover bits of the story, and then you're hearing from Sophie what really happened. And she's young, she's quite naive about the world in lots of ways, but what her storyline really exposes is the kind of class divisions between the women in the story and the kind of inherent tensions with having somebody in your life who's looking after your child, living in your home, and all the kind of neuroses around motherhood that really brings out, and this feeling of unease that we all have when we hand our children over to strangers. You know, we've met them, but essentially strangers. We all have to hand our children over to strangers at some point in their lives, and it's a very odd thing. And the relationship with those people can become fraught. And I find all that those kind of contours of those psychological relationships really interesting. So yeah, she was very fun to write.
Oh, I love hearing that. Let's get into the moms in this group, Claire, Laura, and Nicole. Tell us about these women and this group that Tash has found herself in.
Yeah, so really Tash is living in a basement flat, which isn't very nice and has a broken dishwasher, and she has bills piling up. And even though her and her husband Tom are well-educated, highly qualified, intelligent people who have worked really, really hard in their chosen fields, they just can't afford the luxurious lifestyle in London that Tash sees other people in her area enjoying. And these other mothers seem to have everything she doesn't. So she's intrigued by them for those reasons. And they also, because they have so much more money, they seem to make motherhood look so easy. And Tash is just really seduced by this other version of motherhood that she sees playing out in their play dates in their homes, where, you know, they have macrobiotic recipes on demand and they never do any cooking because everything's made by someone else, and they don't have to wipe down the high chair because they have cleaners, and they don't have to worry about what to take, whether to take their child to the park because they've got incredible huge gardens where the kids can play. And all of that sort of thing is very interesting and seductive to Tash. And she's the sort of person, Tash, who kind of spends a bit too much on her credit card, and she is constantly scrolling property apps to look at other people's houses and kind of wishing for a better life, really. And that is all, and this is kind of her insight, her window into another world, into this other world of wealth in London, which is a city where there's huge inequality between different groups of people, like so many cities in the Western world, I guess. So for that reason, she's kind of initially attracted to them, but she's also, happy to be welcomed into the friendship of these women who seem nice and kind, and they're all going through the same thing. And at one point she talks about how relationships are different when you're a mother because you cover so much ground quickly. If you meet another mother of children and you're a mother of young children, your children are the same age, you know exactly what they're going through. You think, oh God, yeah, they're not sleeping. That, they'll be have up all night with these teething problems, or, whatever it happens to be at that moment. And so you can develop quite intense friendships quite quickly. So she's been craving that companionship and that camaraderie. And so for those two reasons, she's drawn quite powerfully to this group in ways which she will ultimately find very problematic.
Yes, absolutely. But I think that's what helps to make this a really great thriller. And the reason why I enjoyed it so much, seeing the different dynamics unfold and some unhealthy relationships form, and readers will see the end once they pick up a copy. I want to get into the dynamic of motherhood in this book, because I think it's fair to say when you're a new mother, you go through a lot of adjusting. I know that's something I've experienced firsthand. So tell me how much motherhood played a role in you deciding to write this novel and putting the complicated nature of that at the center, while also talking about your inspiration for this book.
Yeah, so absolutely. Motherhood is really when, for me, becoming a mother was the moment when I started taking my writing seriously. And that's partly coincidental because I'd got to the point in my life where I had some time off, right? Because I had a maternity leave with my first baby. And that's when I wrote Greenwich Park, which was my first novel. And the whole experience of pregnancy was so weird, my first pregnancy, that it inspired a lot of Greenwich Park. And then The Other Mothers, which is my second novel, is really been, it's been inspired by that time of having young children and the intensity of that and all of the different, exactly as you say, the changes that brings about in how you see yourself in your relationships with other women, some of those changes which are quite unexpected and some are unwelcome. And I think, Tash, she's really struggling a bit with her identity and she's a bit lost and she's a bit lonely. And I think that that's a really common experience when we have young children, because they change everything in our lives. They change the whole way that we live on a day-to-day basis. They change the things that are important to us. And they change our amount of free time drastically. So we sometimes can't keep up the relationships that we used to have in our old lives. They change our relationships as well. And I think that that's really, really intense and really tough. And so definitely all of that went into this book. Also, I wrote The Other Mothers when I'd just given birth to my second child, and my older one was only 2, and we were just going into a lockdown. So I had no childcare, I had no family support, and a newborn and a toddler. And that was really, there's just like so many people across the world, but it was so intense. And it was kind of like motherhood on steroids. It was really a version of motherhood I'd never signed up to, which is sort of 24/7 soul care of everybody and never getting time and space to write was really, really hard. And so I kind of had all that intensity probably went into the book a bit. But yeah, so motherhood was a huge inspiration. And I think when we're mothers, our fears and the things that we're frightened of and the things that we worry about change too. And I think that they become much less external, like some kind of scary bogeyman character or some knife attacker that might grab us on the street. They become fears. Our lives become sort of smaller and more domestic for a while. And we start to worry about things like, well, can we trust our husband? Like, we're so reliant on each other now as a couple and we've done this thing together. So can I really be sure of him? And can I be sure of my friends and my family? And or what if there is something wrong with the way that I'm raising my child? And, our neuroses become different. And I found all those fears very intense and interesting as well, and fun to play on in psychological fiction. So I guess half of the book, the inspiration comes from motherhood and the intensity of that. The other half of it, of course, comes from my journalistic background, because I was a news reporter for a long time. Tash is a news reporter. And, I've covered a lot of inquests and court cases and murders in my life. So a lot of that was also kind of very useful to draw on for inspiration.
Absolutely. You mentioned Greenwich Park. I was going to get there. Tell us about that book, just in case there's someone listening who's not familiar.
Sure. So Greenwich Park tells the story of Helen, who's a very anxious first-time mother who meets an unpredictable single mother called Rachel at her first antenatal class, and the pair of them strike up an unlikely friendship. As time goes on, Helen becomes unsettled by Rachel's odd behaviour, turning up at her house, seeming to be everywhere that Helen is, and she tries to distance herself, but ends up becoming more and more entangled with Rachel. As time goes on, she starts to wonder whether there is a reason that Rachel was at that antenatal class that day, and she realizes that Rachel was connected to a dark secret from her past, and to individuals in her life, and that Rachel actually threatens to overturn everything in Helen's life if this secret comes out.
I really enjoyed Greenwich Park, but I have to say, I think my favorite is The Other Mothers. And the obvious similarity is that motherhood is at the center of both these books. What other similarities would you say are in both your books that readers might obviously pick out, or just something for them to look forward to?
Well, at the heart, I hope they're both just really engaging mysteries and thrillers with big female characters at the heart. I'm all about women and the relationships between women. That's the great source of fascination for me, and it's always a big preoccupation of my writing. So in that way, they're similar. And motherhood and all the anxieties and neuroses that come with that are also big themes in both books. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really curious because you've given us two great books, Greenwich Park, The Other Mothers. Are you working on any other books? Anything in the works? What can you tell me?
Yeah, I can't tell you very much about it, but I am working on a third thriller. I'm actually kind of getting towards the end of a draft now. But yeah, I don't want to say too much about it. I don't know if it's like a weird superstition thing almost, but I don't know how unusual I am. You've probably spoken to more writers than I have maybe, but I don't know how unusual my process is, but I keep things quite open in the first draft. So I'm not a huge planner. So I like to leave things a bit open-ended really until I get till the very end of a draft. It's when it starts to take shape. And then I go back and do a lot of I'm kind of quote unquote plotting, kind of retrospectively. So I'll go and tighten up the plotting and the pacing once I kind of know where it's all going. But for me, it's a real process of discovery. So yeah, I don't like to talk about it too much, but it will certainly appeal to the same readers of Greenwich Park and The Other Mothers.
Okay, because see, I get you being tight-lipped about it, 100% respect that, and also some authors do get a bit superstitious around that, so I get it 100%. But will this next book revolve around motherhood and mothers again, or will there be a mother at the centre or maybe on the outside?
Yeah, definitely we will see motherhood rearing its head as a theme for sure, yeah.
Okay, awesome. You are a journalist, but since you've authored these two books, Greenwich Park, The Other Mothers, you're working on book number 3, which is really exciting. Looking back, if you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
I think I would say to trust your instinct. That's really important. And to really lean into the kind of joyfulness in the process. I think it's very, very easy to be derailed by self-doubt when you're a writer. We all have this voice in our head saying, oh, this is no good. There's no point carrying on with it. No one wants to read this. It's not working. It's not exciting enough, or it's not well written enough, or it's not literary enough. And, who do I think I am pretending to be a writer when there's so many amazing writers out there? It's undoubtedly all true in a way. I mean, there are amazing writers out there that I could never dream of my book sitting alongside, perhaps. But that doesn't mean, just because other people are better than you at something, it doesn't mean that your work doesn't have a unique voice and a unique audience. And if you're writing a book that you would want to read and you're a reader, then, I think that that's the main thing. And I think it's really, I got a lot of self-discipline from being a journalist. The most important lessons were, the kind of strict lesson that it is about the reader. It's not about you. You can't do things that are ego-driven, or you can, but no one will ever want to read them. You have to think about, you have to be tough on yourself when you're a writer, and you have to say, okay, is this chapter really serving a purpose? Is all this description really important to anyone but me? Is it serving the plot? Is it serving the reader? Is the reader getting bored at this point? So you have to do all that, and you have to be tough with yourself, but that's not the same thing as kind of being so hard on yourself that you never get anything done. So I think you have to kind of quiet those voices sometimes and just lean into writing for the love of writing, and just enjoy it. I think, and I think with my second book particularly, I listened far too much to all the kind of advice from other people about the right way to write a book. And most people think that that's, sitting down and plotting something, which it's not that I don't have any clue when I sit down to my desk and start writing a novel what it's going to be about. I always start with a spark of an idea or a character in a place, and I go from there. But it doesn't, for me, I've realized that that's okay, that my process is non-linear, shall we say. And it takes me a while kind of writing around something to get to the heart of it. Because when I've sat down and tried to kind of put all the chapters I'm going to write in a spreadsheet and then write them, that just feels really boring to me, and the writing comes out really flat. So that it's quite important to realize that actually you do have your own process and it's valid, and you should kind of, you can trust your own instincts, really.
Yes, absolutely. So getting into your reading life, because I love hearing what authors are reading. Tell me about the last book that you finished reading that you'd now recommend.
That's a great question. I've read some really good books this year, actually. I actually just picked it up again to reread it, but I loved The Whispers by Ashley Audrain. That was one of my best novels this year. And if you're interested in themes around motherhood, that is an absolute must read. Her first book was The Push, which was a huge hit, but I actually think The Whispers is better. And it tells the story of the kind of ramifications of an accident involving a child in this very kind of gossipy suburban community with lots of different really fascinating female characters. And I just absolutely loved that. I recently had to write a piece on winter thrillers. So I ended up reading quite a lot of kind of snowy thrillers, which was great fun. And I really loved Beware the Woman by Megan Abbott. That was a great thriller. I think that came out this summer. I think she's an incredible writer anyway. And I love her book. They kind of sit on the edge of like thriller, horror, but she's just an incredible writer. And again, really interesting themes there about the loss of autonomy with our bodies when we become mothers. So if you liked Greenwich Park or The Other Mothers, then you'll probably enjoy that one. And then just for a kind of something completely different and kind of high octane, high concept, I really enjoyed The Drift by CJ Tudor, which is something totally different, but it's a thriller set in a kind of post-pandemic world in where there's this terrible virus and there are people trapped in a mountain in a kind of old ski resort, and then another group trapped in a ski lift that's not working, and none of them really remember how they got there, and another group is in a bus that's crashed, but they can't work out why there's no safety doors or hammers on the inside. It's just really, really, really clever, really well plotted, and yeah, very, very enjoyable.
Yay! I love hearing that. What was your favourite childhood book that you can remember?
Oh, my favourite childhood book. That's really hard. I was a really voracious reader as a child. I didn't read, I'd probably be embarrassed to name one book because I read everything and nothing of very high quality. Like I was obsessed with Enid Blyton, read everything by Enid Blyton. And then I got into quite dark books like Point Horror and Goosebumps and just kind of read all of those. And then I got into authors like Nina Borden and Ruth Thomas, who are British writers who kind of, I suppose they did sort of thrillers for kids in a way. And I think the key thing, and Jacqueline Wilson, I think the key thing about all those kinds of books was that they treated kids with respect and allowed them, I guess, to access themes that were quite dark and difficult. And I think that gave me really the idea of stories that can be really exciting and really dark and really challenging. And, by reading, you can access them, and your parents, they can't possibly read everything you're reading. So you can kind of, you can read stuff that maybe they won't. There were things that I explored in my reading as a child that, were very, very far from my lived experience and far from things I had ever discussed with my parents. And I loved that. I remember reading a novel called Playing Beatty Bow, which we read at school, and it's a story about a girl who time travels back into the Victorian era through the medium of this like magical dress that she finds. That book really had an impact on me as a child. I think I was about 9 when I read it, and it was just the characters in it were so real to me, and I was absolutely devastated when she kind of had to come back from reality, from this Victorian world. And I don't know, I think it was a bit of a moment for me of realising what the potential of books was. And then I guess when I got to secondary school, I got into kind of more proper books. I got very into Jane Austen. I remember starting reading. I read Pride and Prejudice when I was babysitting at someone else's house, and they had it on the shelf. And I thought, I've heard of Pride and Prejudice. I'd heard that was a thing, but I didn't know anything about Jane Austen. But I read this book and I thought, this is so funny. I didn't expect it to be funny. I thought it was literature, so it was going to be hard work. And it was just such a joy. And, her books are just so joyful. And then I just read all of her books. And then I got very interested in Margaret Atwood as an older teen, and Jean Rhys, and also Ian McEwan. I got very into Margaret Atwood after reading one of her novels, Cat's Eye, which is about girls bullying each other, basically. It's about the bullying that happens when you're a young girl, 12, 13, 14 years old. And there's that kind of very normal thing where your friends become actually your worst enemies. And suddenly one day your best friends don't want to hang around with you anymore, and you're on your own, and they don't want you in the clique anymore. And that is something that I'd lived through. And then I was reading about it in a book that was by this kind of incredible world-leading author who everyone respected. And that made me realize that my experiences are actually worthy of being in novels, and that and so that was quite an eye-opening book for me, Cat's Eye, and I loved it. And I read everything by Margaret Atwood, and I'm still her biggest fan in the whole world, and often reread her books just to kind of remember how she did things or how she handled a certain character or a certain situation, because she's been a huge inspiration to me. And the same thing kind of happened to me with Jean Rhys when I read her for the first time, and particularly the novel Voyage in the Dark, which is really just about the experience of being a young girl, and of course in Edwardian Britain. But really those themes still resonated with me as a young teenager, trying to find their place in the world and navigate the attentions of men as your status changes from a kind of young girl to a sort of sexualized figure, and how uncomfortable that feels and awkward that feels and how difficult it is to navigate was painted so beautifully. So at all those points in my life, books were a kind of refuge for me and a mirror to some of the things I was thinking about and feeling. And I guess that's how they became so important to me, and how reading became so important to me in my life.
I really love hearing that. And truthfully, today, I wish we would just let children read the books that they want to read, especially because it's so hard to get them to read anyway, because everyone wants to be on, a gadget, a tablet, a phone or something. But I just wish we trusted children with the books some more. I really do, because I feel the same way.
You have to trust them. And I think that they can handle so much more than you think.
Yes, absolutely. And the art of being, or not the art, but more the experience, that's a word, the experience of being seen in literature, especially if you're going through something. Like, it doesn't have to be, marker for marker for marker, exactly like that person, but just the feelings, the experiences. I really wish as a society we would trust our children with the books more, especially here in the States when we're going through so many book banning. But yes, I think we should trust our children more and be happy that they want to pick up a book. So
yeah, and I think actually they self-police. I think if it's too much for them, they'll put it down. And with my daughter, if anything, because I was reading quite intense stuff at a young age. My older daughter, she's only 6, but I tried her on a few things. She said, "Actually, Mummy, I don't like this." And I thought, okay, we'll leave that a couple of years. But she's reading a lot of Jacqueline Wilson at the moment while I'm reading it to her. But there's a lot of themes in there about divorce and about bullying and about kids at school being really cruel to each other. And, she's growing up in a world where that kind of cruelty and bullying is completely unacceptable, and where there's a lot more talked in primary school about being kind and about respecting other people and other people's mental health. And the children's mental health is a big preoccupation of teachers in a way that it didn't used to be when we were growing up, which is really amazing. So I think some of the stuff in the books that I read growing up is actually quite shocking to her. The idea that bullying could be kind of extended and carry on and nobody does anything about it is something that she's found really, really dark and shocking. So that's been quite an interesting experience to kind of read the books that I read as a child, and in her kind of new generation's eyes of just finding it all totally shocking.
Yes, they are living in a different world. Absolutely.
Yeah, and thank goodness.
Yes, for sure. So on the show, we have readers who are in different stages in their reading journey. So tell us, Katherine, what advice would you give to someone who, one, wants to incorporate more reading into their lives? Maybe they're struggling with finding the time, but also for an avid reader who's probably going through a reading slump right now. What advice has worked for you?
I think the best advice if you're going through a reading slump is to pick up a kind of oldie but a goodie, a book that you love, and reread it. That would be my advice. Or go back to an author who you love, and see if you can find something in their back catalogue that you've not had a chance to read before. And I think that, I do that a lot. I love to reread books that I've really loved. Yeah, and I think also just unashamedly, just trust your taste and just read what you like. Don't kind of, I think some people read books as a kind of punishment, and they feel like they start a book, they don't really like it, they feel like they need to keep going with it. I completely disagree with that. I just ditch them. I actually download a lot of samples on my Kindle, and if I'm not really feeling a book, I don't read the whole thing. I mean, I just don't. I mean, I read loads and loads of books, but I think life's too short to read things that you're not really enjoying. I think just read for joy and keep it joyful, and then it will always be this kind of wonderful part of your life. And I think when it starts going wrong is when people read out of a sense of duty. I mean, some books are quieter books, and they take longer to grow and to get into. And I think that's obviously there's a place for that. And I'm not kind of saying that everything has to grab you in the first 5 seconds. Like, I don't agree with that. But I also think that if you're not feeling something, just move on to something that you like better. I think that it has to be something that's joyful.
Yes, I agree. Focus on the joy. So on the show, we also love indie bookstores. So share with our listeners some of your favourite indies.
Okay, so my local indies, I'm Stokey Bookshop. So Stoke Newington is where I live in Hackney, and Stoke Newington Bookshop is the most amazing indie bookstore, and they always stock my books, which is why we love them so much. But also they have so much just amazing books and loads of local books. And actually one of the threads of this current novel that I'm writing, it's all set around the Regent's Canal in North London, and I got interested in that when I just picked up a book from there, which was a memoir of somebody who'd lived on a canal boat. And I would have probably never picked it up, but they had it on one of their tables with one of those little stickers saying that, that one of their staff had really enjoyed it. And I thought, that's really interesting. I'd always been kind of interested in the idea of living on a boat and what that would be like living on one of those narrow boats in London. And it was completely fascinating, this book. And so I love that about indie bookstores, how you can just end up walking out with something that you never thought that you would. And then that's, for me, has ended up being a whole thread of what I'm actually writing at the moment. So those connections that you forge in bookshops are just so magical. And so I love that. Inkut 84 is another local book to me. That's in Highbury in North London. They're incredible. They always have just this amazing selection of books, and also children's books. So I buy a lot for my children in there too. And they also serve great coffee. I mean, what is not to love?
Yes, absolutely. There is nothing not to love there. I love a good coffee. I love when I can maybe get cake. But what's absolutely fabulous is when you can get books for you, but you can also get books for your littles as well.
Yeah, you can get books for anybody in that store. It's just it's tiny but amazingly comprehensive. And I guess that's what good indie bookstores do really well.
Yes, that's what they do really well, for sure. All right, so getting back to the other mothers, again, I know you've done your job, you've written the book, you've given it to us, but in an ideal world, what are you hoping readers might think or feel, or maybe what are some of the reactions you're hoping for after they've turned the very last page?
Well, I hope that they feel they've had a really satisfying journey of reading the book and they've really enjoyed it and that it's been escapism for them. That's the main thing that I want people to feel, is just enjoyment. And I love the idea of spreading that joy and giving that gift to people that I get from a good book. When you really can't put it down because you're enjoying it so much, that's to people. When people tell me that that's been their experience, that's the best thing that I could ever hear, because I know what that's like and I love it so much myself, and it's such a joy of my life. To be able to give that to, thousands of people potentially across the world is the most incredible feeling. But also I hope that, like we were talking about, that people feel seen in my books, particularly other women, maybe women who have been mothers or maybe women who haven't, but they've, they're connected to motherhood, they're connected to that process, or they have, most women have a relationship to motherhood in some way or form, whether it's having a your relationship with your own mother, or you the fact that you definitely don't want to be one. It's something that we can't help it being a dynamic of all of our lives and our biology. So I love that it connects with women. And I had somebody on Instagram message me the other day saying that every time I'm breastfeeding my baby, I sit down and read a bit more, and I'm just really loving it. And it's providing me with so much entertainment in this kind of like quiet season of my life where I'm, at home with my baby. And so that's just wonderful to me. And yeah, I guess I hope that they become lifelong readers of mine, and that we get to share, I get to share more of my stories with them, and that they'll look out for my books in future. So yeah, it's just the whole thing and that personal connection is just so wonderful.
Yes, I can only imagine. That must be so wonderful to receive little notes like that. So readers, if you haven't already, Katherine's first book is Greenwich Park, but book 2 is The Other Mothers, and I hope you'll give one or both of these books a go. Katherine, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's been such a joy. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reader's Couch podcast. Please subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, and take a few seconds to leave a rating and review. Until next time, stay lounging, stay reading, and whenever you're in doubt, go straight to your local bookstore or library. Thanks again for listening, and happy reading.